Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we're going to talk about some of the ways that Wicca is really markedly different from a lot of historical paganism. This is brought to you by my current reread of Homer. I worked my way through the Odyssey, and now I'm going back and rereading the Iliad, and I have a lot of thoughts about Homer. We're not going to get into those here, but in general, my working through Homer has been prompting me to think a lot about ancient religion and just the ways that Wicca is really quite a different animal. Wicca is weird, everybody. Wicca is a weird religion. Not in the sense of like its specific theology or anything like. I mean, also that, but all religion is weird if you get into the specific theology, right? Like the Christians have a guy who came back from the dead. That's kind of their whole thing, and no one talks about how weird that is. No, Wicca is really surprisingly different from a lot of historical religion in ways that I think deserve attention and interrogation. For one thing, I mean, probably the biggest thing, right, is that, like, religion in the ancient world was very much a public affair. We, especially in the US today, I think we have this attitude of, like, religion is meant to be something private. Religion is your personal belief. And while American politics doesn't actually do this, we have this kind of lofty ideal of religion being kept out of the public sphere, right? There's no such thing as a state religion in the United States legally. De facto, American evangelical, or at least American Protestant Christianity is the default state religion. But regardless, like officially and idealistically, we don't have a state religion, and the idea of religion interfering in public life is really quite scandalous to a lot of American sensibilities. And that's very different from the role that religion played in a lot of the ancient world, where religion and politics were just one and the same, right? In places where you had a monarchy, the monarchy was endowed with the right to rule by some kind of divine authority. You look at the role that religion played in civic life, and it was so prominent and it was so present. Obviously, different areas had very different customs, and it's difficult to generalize and important, I think, not to make sweeping generalizations. But if we think, for example, specifically about ancient Greek religion, because that's where my mind is because I'm reading Homer, these religious festivals ended up being major civic occasions, right? A religious holiday was a civic event. There would be a public sacrifice. City officials would be involved. There would be a parade. And the relationship between religion and public life was very, very close. Right? One of the things, when Socrates was put on trial, one of the things that he was charged with was corrupting the youth, and specifically corrupting the youth by leading them not to believe in the gods. There's nuance. That's good enough for a YouTube video. But religion was very public and very social. Religion was not something that you as an individual do in private. It was a part of your social identity. And attending public sacrifices, attending public ritual, right, making offerings to a temple, tithing in societies that have tithing, right, like these are all really important parts of how religion was a part of public life. And Wicca, more so obviously the solitary eclectic forms of Wicca, but Wicca tends to be very private. And in a lot of ways, Wicca tends to be very individual. Even in coven-based Wicca, you have this expectation that people are building a personal relationship with the gods, and that it is somehow private and direct and intimate, and that a lot of that happens behind closed doors. And that's not a conception of religion or of the relationship with the gods that we see in a lot of the ancient world. It pops up from time to time. But by and large, the gods are kind of bigger than you, and they're out there, and they're like, very few people in the ancient world are talking to the gods and expecting the gods to talk back. I have a previous video about that, about the question of like, do the gods talk to us? Because certainly it's a thing you see in a lot of contemporary paganism. People will talk about relationships that they have with their deities, where they communicate directly, where the gods talk back to them or communicate to them in some way, whether that is through intuition, clairsentience, clairaudience, divination, dreams, whatever it may be. And I admittedly tend to be very skeptical of that sort of thing. Not to say it doesn't happen, but I am often skeptical of it. And that, I mean, that leads into a broader thing of like, I think there's a social norm in a lot of contemporary paganism where I won't question your bullshit if you don't question my bullshit, right? I think we tend to kind of, we're all aware that what we're doing is weird, and so we don't challenge weirdness in other people because we don't want our own weirdness challenged. So there's sort of this like tacit truce where we will let people talk about things that we might privately be like, oh, wow, that is, we do not inhabit the same consensus reality. But there's kind of a quiet agreement that we don't challenge each other on those sorts of things, which there are positives and negatives to that, right? Like, I don't know that I necessarily need to take a side on that, but I think it's a thing that happens. But getting myself back on topic, there is, I think, a very strong sense in a lot of contemporary paganism, and especially Wicca, that your religion is personal and that you are going to have personal and direct experiences of the gods that other people are not a part of and maybe don't really have the ability to speak on with authority, right? Other people can't interpret my experiences with the gods. And we don't see a lot of that in the ancient world. People are not talking to gods that frequently, or they're not conversing with gods that frequently, right? People might pray, people might make offerings. In these things vary demographically, but like in ancient Slavic religion, for example, what little evidence we have, we don't have a ton of archaeological evidence, but there's decent evidence to suggest that in ancient Slavic religion, it was not super common to ask the gods for things. So you would make offerings to the gods, you would sacrifice, you would pray and offer praise and things like that. But if you wanted things done, there was more of an ancestor cult, more of an like ancestral theology, more of a connection with local kind of animistic spirits. And like those were the spirits that you would go to. You would go to the spirits of the land or the spirits of the dead if you wanted something. And the gods were kind of just there to praise. Again, there's not great evidence on that, and a lot of the evidence that is available on that is inaccessible for one reason or another. So it's very difficult to get good information, but that at least seems to be the consensus among contemporary practitioners who are working at reconstructing historic Slavic polytheism. So there's like varying degrees, right? Obviously, we have lots of accounts in ancient Greece of people making sacrifices to the gods and asking for specific things. But there was often an awareness that those prayers would go unanswered. The relationship really seemed to be transactional, and there wasn't necessarily direct communication involved. You might have appointed priests, you might have appointed seers, people whose job it was to receive training and to be able to communicate or divine the will of the gods. But for most people, it was like, okay, you make your sacrifice, and then that's it. It's not like, oh, you make your sacrifice, and then you're going to get a feeling, and, Poseidon is going to whisper in your ear and say, like, no, actually, I wanted a different color of ox. So that sense of reciprocity that a lot of us have, and that really intimate personal relationship with the divine that is so common in contemporary paganism, we don't see a lot of it in the ancient world. And this is not just a Wicca thing. I think you see it in other areas of contemporary paganism as well. I think there are ways in which there is bleed over from Wicca into some other areas of contemporary paganism, and you see like the Reconstructionists get really salty about that. The Reconstructionists get really upset with people who are like, you know, not all Reconstructionists. Let me be clear, but you will occasionally see in Reconstructionist communities a sense of real strong frustration with people who are expressing close, intimate, direct personal relationships with gods that are just not historically attested, that are not historically kind of the way that people would probably have related to those gods. And I think that part of that, if we're being honest, is kind of a bleed over of Wiccan practices and approaches into the general pagan community, right? Like thinking about the history of 20th century paganism, Wicca comes on the scene. For many decades, it is the default form of paganism, and people who are interested in whatever Norse gods or Greek gods or Egyptian gods or whatever end up kind of importing Wiccan ritual forms and Wiccan structures and Wiccan assumptions about deity onto whatever type of paganism they're trying to do. And as the scholarship gets better, you have a lot of people who are moving away from that, but I think you still see a lot of it in the general pagan community, and you'll have people who will have, who will maybe describe themselves as pagan and not Wiccan, who work with non-Wiccan deities, but who do so in a way that in many ways I think closely resembles sort of Wiccan attitude of that direct personal relationship with the gods. And right, the direct personal relationship thing, to a certain extent, it makes sense if you think about the early context of Wicca. Wicca nowadays, if we're using kind of the broader sense of the term Wicca, means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. When Wicca first comes on the scene, it is an initiatory mystery cult, and people who are Wiccan are priests of particular gods, so it makes sense that they would be expected to cultivate a kind of direct relationship that ordinary practitioners might not necessarily be expected to have. But I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting and it's weird. And oh gosh, I mean, like, Wicca's weird. Wicca is so weird. So we have all of the, like, your own personal Jesus stuff that we've talked about. But then there's also the gods are very different and very weird, right? Like, I've talked about this elsewhere, but you don't find the Wiccan gods in historical pantheons. Hell, that's why I wrote Queen of All Witcheries, is to point out that, like, this is a new goddess. This is a modern goddess. There are some historical deities that she bears more or less resemblance to, right? She is probably, of historical deities, she's probably closest to, like, Diana and Isis, but she's not exactly the same as either of them, and there's a lot going on. And same thing with the horned god, right? Like, you can look for some historical deities who kind of, or who have horns, right? You can look at, like, Pan or the Gaulish Cernunnos, who is so poorly historically attested that no one knows anything about him. People have made a couple of pretty educated surmises about things that he might be associated with, but, like, we don't have extant prayers, we don't have surviving texts, we don't have rituals or temples built to Cernunnos. Like, not no one. Very little concretely is known about that god, so like, there are some horned gods that are attested in history. We don't know a ton about a lot of them, and some of them line up with the contemporary horned god in some ways, and in other ways they don't, right? There are ways, Jason Menke would disagree with me on this. There are ways in which I think the horned god of Wicca much more closely resembles Osiris than like the Greek god Pan. And there's a matter of personal theology there. There is room for differing perspectives, again, because Wicca involves this, like, direct personal relationship with the gods, and my experience of the gods is not going to be the same as someone else's. But, Like, the gods of Wicca, they're weird, they're different, they're idiosyncratic, they kind of come out of nowhere. They don't exactly come out of nowhere, they mostly come out of the Golden Bough. Praise be to James Fraser. Regardless, Wicca's just, it's such a different religion than anything we have in ancient paganism. The way that Wiccan ritual is done, right? We don't have permanent temple spaces. We temporarily create a sacred space. Like, and there are scatterings of these things in the ancient world. Obviously, magic circles go back a very, very long time. Practice of ritual nudity exists in, here and there all over the ancient world. But, like, if you took just kind of an average person off the street in ancient Sparta, or if you took an average person from, whatever, ancient Iceland, and not even ancient, but like early medieval Iceland, and you showed them Wicca, it would not feel familiar to them. It would feel very different than the way that they know of their gods, the way that they worship their gods, the rituals that they do, the way that they relate to their gods, what they think about their gods, who their gods are. And I think it's really interesting. I don't know that I have much more of a point than that. I am going to wrap this video up here. Thank you for watching. I'll catch you sometime soon. Bye.